So we're in Muktzah, and we're in the 21st chapter of Shabbat. We've been circling around the concepts of Muktzah actually for quite a few chapters, and now we're going to circle in a little bit more. And we're talking about mixtures, really mixtures. So something which is Muktzah, which has no purpose on Shabbat, so we can't move it, which is all kind of tied up or mixed in with something else. So we're in these boundary cases again. So we'll be dealing with mixtures of substances or objects together, or one object on top of another object. These are all situations where the halacha isn't quite clear cut, and actually where the sages are going to go out of their way to a certain extent to allow us to move these objects with, at least with some restrictions. So we're going to begin at the beginning of the 21st chapter. Notel Adam et bito ve'ha'even biyado. A person can pick up his son while he has a stone in his hand. So the stone is muktzah. It's not a kli. It's got no purpose on Shabbat. Very interesting, by the way, that there are some places in Jerusalem where if you drive through on Shabbat, they will throw stones at you. And you might ask, well, how can they do that? Because the stone is muktzah on Shabbat. The answer, I think, is they have to designate them before Shabbat for throwing. And so you do hear stories about houses with little piles of stones outside them as Shabbat comes in, which are designated for throwing. But in general, if you don't designate a stone for throwing, then you can't move it on Shabbat. So what do you do if you have to pick up your son and your son has got a stone in his hand? Because clearly the son is not muktzah. He's a human being. You can handle him on Shabbat. So you do pick up your son while he has a stone in his hand. And then even extending that analogy, and a kalkala is a basket. And a basket with a stone in it. In other words, if there's some other stuff in the basket that we need, and we can't easily just tip it out and get the stone out, we can pick up the basket with the stone on Shabbat, even though the stone itself is muktzah. It doesn't make the rest of the object muktzah. So my wife actually puts will put light candles on a tray on Shabbat and then put an orange on the tray. So the tray is being used not just to carry the candlesticks, but to carry the orange. And then she can move the tray after the candles stop burning. And along the same lines, umataltalin truma tamea im haTorah. And if we have to move truma, which is impure, so a priest can't eat it, with that which is pure, we can do that. Ve'im hachulin, and with non-sacred produce. So we got mixtures of food here. And Rabbi Yehuda says, af ma'alinet ha'medumab echad umeah. Rabbi Yehuda is talking about a situation where you've got a mixture of truma and chulin. And we learned in the Masachet of Trumot that this mixture is called meduma. It's mixed up. And it has the status of truma, unless the truma is outweighed by a factor of 100 to 1. And if that is the case, say you put a little bit of truma into a barrel that's got, 105 measures of grain in it, then the truma is, there's not enough truma to invalidate the whole of the, let's say, the silo, the whole of the barrel. But we still have to take something out. So we take a quantity of truma, we take a quantity of corn out of the silo, equivalent to what came in, and we say, oh yeah, okay, this is truma. And there is a halachic opinion that that somehow in the halachic world, what you've taken out is exactly the truma that you did put in. And this is what Rabbi Yehuda's view is, that if truma falls into a silo on Shabbat, you can take it out, because you're not separating truma on Shabbat, you're just taking out the truma that fell in. And you won't be surprised to hear that the halacha actually does not go by Rabbi Yehuda, because it is a bit too close to separating truma on Shabbat, which we know we can't do. What about if the stone is on top of something that we need. So we dealt with the stone in the basket. What if it's on top of a cask? I'm using the Safaria translation here, and Safaria translates chavit as cask, and that's pretty fine. We could say barrel. But I want to remember that in the time of the Mishnah, this was probably an earthenware cask. It was probably an earthenware jug, because that's how they used to store wine in those days. You'd have jugs of wine in your cellar. So let's just keep that in mind, and let's just read on. You've got a stone on the mouth of a cask. You want to get it off. Maybe you want to get at the cask itself. Mata al sidar v'hinofet. So we're going to tilt the cask to one side, and the stone's going to fall off. So we can move the cask, move the flask, move the jug without moving the stone, or the stone's fallen off anyway. Haita bein hachaviyot. What if it was sitting among a whole bunch of other flasks? Maybe at this point, maybe we can't tilt it. Or maybe we're anxious that if we do tilt it, this stone is going to break another earthenware cask. The earthenware gets really important here, right? If you have a big cellar full of wine casks all made of earthenware, you don't want to have stones which are suddenly just falling down in pieces, because it could have serious implications for the integrity of your wine. And if it breaks another jug of wine, that's a major economic loss. And in fact, we're going to learn tomorrow about broken wine vessels. So what are we going to do? If it was standing among all the other barrels, we're going to lift it up and actually tilt it onto its side, and it's going to fall off. So we are really quite actively removing this stone from the top of the barrel, the top of the flask. And along the same lines, ma'ot shial hakar, if we have money lying on a cushion, noer et hakar v'hen nofel, we're going to shake the cushion, and it's going to fall off. Haita alav lash loshet. Loshet is dirt, but it's dirt in a fully, I would say it's dirt as a euphemism for real dirt. So this might be, I don't know, it might be excrement, it might be it's disgusting stuff. For some reason, you've got something really horrible on this cushion and you want to get it off. It's, by the way, the Hebrew shilshul for diarrhea is the same root as this word loshet for dirt. Haita alav lash loshet. There was dirt on it. Mekancha bismartut. We're going to wipe it with a smartut, with a rag. Haitashel, or if it was, because we're not going to wash it. We're not going to wash it on Shabbat, because that really is laundering, right? But we're going to wipe it with a rag. Haitashel, or what if it was a leather cushion? Not nin aleha maim ad shetichle. Well, if it's a leather cushion, there's no question of washing. So we could actually just pour water over it until it disappears, because the status of leather, the status of cloth is, if you pour water in and out of it, you're squeezing it in and out. Effectively you're laundering it, but water over leather is just like a torrent of water. So there's no question there of actually carrying out laundry on Shabbat. So for a leather cushion cover, we just pour water over it. What about stuff that is inedible on a table? So not so much the stone on the mouth of the cask or the money lying on the cushion, but we finished our meal and we've got bones and nutshells on the table. And Beit Shammai say, by the way, this is the version of the Mishnah in the printed text. So I'm using the printed text, which actually I have in my version of Kahati, and Safaria has. Safaria takes it from Koran, which is a Vilna text. So this is kind of the classic printed text of the Mishnah. Beit Shammai omrim makbehin min hashulchan atzamot uklifin. Beit Shammai say we can remove bones and nutshells from the table. Now these are not human food now, so they have no purpose on Shabbat. They are muktzah. They might be animal food, but like the stones, which we probably don't designate for throwing before Shabbat, the bones and nutshells aren't designated as animal food before Shabbat, because before Shabbat they're human food. They only become animal food when we finished eating the human bits out of them. So there is a question: if they're muktzah, how can we move them? Well, Beit Shammai say, look, they have the intrinsic status of animal food, and you can move them off. You can move them off the table on Shabbat. Beit Hillel are a bit stricter, and that's unusual, by the way. Beit Hillel are normally lenient, and Beit Shammai are normally strict. But in this Mishnah, Beit Hillel are strict, and they say we're going to take the whole of the tabletop and give it a shake until the bones and the nutshells fall off, just as we're going to give the cushion a shake and let the money fall off. And along the same lines, we can remove from the table crumbs which are less than the size of an olive and husks of beans and lentils, because it looks like the Mishnah considers them already to be designated as food for animals. Sfog, a sfog is a sponge. Maybe that is cognate. Sfog, sponge. Im yesh or bein beit achiza. If it's got a leather handle, mukan chinbo, we can wipe up with it. Ve'im lav ein mukan chinbo, we don't wipe with it. We're not going to wipe with it because, again, we're not going to squeeze out the sponge on Shabbat by grasping it. If we grab it with the handle, that's fine, but we don't want to grasp the sponge itself and squeeze it out. Although the sages say, Chachamim omrim, vein kach uvein kach, nital b'Shabbat, one way or the other, you can pick it up on Shabbat, ve'eino mekabel tuma, and it doesn't attract tuma, because it's not a garment, and it's not a tent, and it's not a vessel. A sponge is a very interesting example of something which is a kli. It is falls in the definition of kli. It's a piece of gear, a piece of equipment, but it's not of the kind of equipment that can accept tuma. It's a bit like a book, actually. Sponge and book, they can't take tuma. And I want just to say in conclusion that there is an opposite version of this Mishnah, which is presented in the Tosefta. Remember, we were surprised that Beit Hillel was lenient and Beit Shammai was that Beit Shammai was lenient and Beit Hillel was strict. Usually it's the other way around. And sure enough, if you go and look at the Kaufman manuscript, which is on Sefaria, or if you look in the Tosefta, I think it's Tosefta chapter 17, I've given it below on the source sheet, the Mishnah is this text in the Mishnah is indeed presented the other way around. Beit Hillel omrim magbehin me'al hashulchan. Beit Hillel say you can remove the bones of the nutshell, and Beit Shammai say no, you can't remove them. You need to shake the tabletop. The Gemara actually clearly knows both versions, because the Gemara discusses which one is correct. So clearly, both of these are ancient versions. One of them is in the printed text. One of them is in the Kaufman manuscript and in the Tosefta.